Good day, class. We are now in our lecture 4 with the title What's in It for Me on Egoism and Social Contract Theory. Two of the key terminologies here, class, are the egoism and the social contract theory. But first, let us define the root word for this, no? The ego. What is ego or egoism? A person who is known as an egoist is known for their big ego. Sometimes we use this kind of word referring to a person who has a big pride, and this pride that we have could be linked into negative or positive. Now, what exactly is the ego? If we will search it in Google, the results could be like the famous theory of personality of Sigmund Freud about the id, ego, and the superego, the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. Some could define it as people who are self-centered and care little for other people. But if we will use philosophical ethics in defining ego, ego is concerned with the role of the self as the motivation and goal of one's action. In short, the ego is responsible in our action towards a particular situation. Either people do act in it through self-interest or prescribing that they should. Other definition naman, class, it is our conscious mind, the part of our identity that we consider ourselves. Even though there are some negative definition of egoism, there might be different connotations to philosophers. Philosophers who are called ethical egoists argue that to act morally is to maximize one's self-interest. Above all, being ethical, class, is not all about seeking our own or our self-interest. The morality reminds us to keep promises, to treat others fairly, and to benefit those in need. It demands us that we don't act only in our self-interest. What they mean for this, class, is that those philosophers who are ethical egoists, they focus on one's self-interest or yung pansariling decision lamang. However, in ethics, it is not all about seeking self-interest because in morality, no, or in doing morality, we are focusing always to do good or to do fairly and equal, especially the good one. The answers of this question, what exactly is the relationship between ethics and self-interest, will be our focus in this lecture. We will see how these three views, the psychological egoism, ethical egoism, and social contract theory, address this kind of question: what exactly is the relationship between ethics and the self interest? Before we proceed to each theory, here is a rough picture about these three perspectives. Like the psychological egoism, it claims that true altruistic behavior is nothing more than wishful thinking because everything we do is by definition of self-serving. Ethical egoism argues that even if we could be unselfish, we can ignore any demand that ethics makes on us because we should put ourselves first. While the social contract theory, it claims that ethics itself is rooted in self-interest, that is, that we should really take others into account, but only ultimately because doing so is in accord with what we want and need for ourselves. Uh, the key terminologies that we need to define here, class, are Of course, the three theories and also like altruism and self-interest, we will hear mostly of these words in this chapter. Let us begin with the psychological egoism. Psychological egoism argue that everything we do is self-serving or sa sarili lang natin, even if we think it is not. Self-sacrificial behaviors are not motivated by altruistic concern. Altruistic behavior means last, unselfish concern for the welfare of other people. Those behaviors that we are more concerned no, for other people. And then, yun sabi nga ng psychological egoism is that self-sacrificial behaviors are not motivated by altruistic concern. Given that statement, doing what one most wants to do is in one's self-interest. One's self-sacrificing behavior is egoistic. Then psychological egoist states that altruism or unselfish behaviors is nothing but an illusion. And because here in psychological egoism perspective class, we are doing this kind of action. It is because of it is our interest. It is our self-interest. And we are doing this kind of actions or decisions not for other people but sa atin lamang. However, if doing what I am motivated to do is always self-serving, then trivially there is a sense in which all our actions are self-serving. From this mindset, plus no, we have the tendency to lure ourselves because we think that everything we do or everything everything or all our motive actions, we think that everything in it is always self-serving. And sometimes it could result to have doubts or being indecisive. Mhm. To avoid this charge class, an egoist needs to avoid interpreting psychological egoism as whatever the action whatever the action that we do is always self-serving. So to avoid that kind of definitions that we have, no, the psychological egoism proposes a better strategy, like to emphasize one does an action or we we do this kind of action in order to further one's self-interest. We act only for the sake of promoting our own best interest. It's like, ano lang class ba, avoid thinking or avoid defining that every actions na pinoportray mo is always self-serving kahit na deep inside, hindi naman. But you always assume na na itong ginagawa ko is para sa sarili ko, hindi to para sa ibang tao. Pero sa kaloob-looban naman ng sarili mo is hindi naman talaga, alam mong hindi naman talaga siya self-serving or pansariling motive mo lang yung ginagawa mo. Maybe we drive into that kind of situation maybe because you are pressured or maybe someone told you na ito yung dapat na gawin mo and then nag-instill na lang sa subconscious mo na I'm doing this kind of action kasi nakaka-benefit to sa akin, na ako lang. Pero, meron na din siyang kaakibat, no? Or kasama na ginagawa ko to. It's because ito lang yung mga actions, nakatanggap-tanggap ako sa ibang tao. But here, in the perspective of psychological egoism, no, they avoid that kind of thinking. Make sure that all your motivations, all the actions na ginagawa mo sa isang situation, it is because of your own self-interest. So they are avoiding this kind of thought na naniloloko mo yung sarili mo na lahat ng ginagawa mo is para sa sarili mo, 'di ba? Kasi sometimes we have this kind of behavior na just to fit in, we are doing things na labag sa atin and nasasanay na lang din tayo na gawin natin siya. And then after that we realize na hindi pala tayo masaya dun sa ginagawa natin. So yun yung ibig sabihin ng psychological egoism because here we are promoting our own best interest. No, we are promoting our action based our own best interest. Kasi kagustuhan talaga natin to. Walang involved na ibang tao. Many philosophers class agree that our ultimate goal or ultimate motivation of one's action is our one's best interest. What they disagree on is how to understand the idea of one's best interest. So, paano ba natin malalaman kung ito talaga yung pinaka-interest natin? So, ito din yung nagiging problem. No? Kung paano ba natin masasabi na itong ginagawa natin is talagang we want it. No? That there's no other involvement of people's decision no, sa ating mga ginagawa. From the previous chapter, when Aristotle says that eudaimonia, his term for the happiness, is the rational ultimate goal, for Spinoza naman, the ultimate goal of one's action is to realize oneself or develop oneself. So in order for us to identify and to understand the idea of one's best interest, we should have this kind of realization of ourselves and how to develop our own self. So then, an egoist must have self-realization or self-development that specifies what is ideal action or interest that the individual wants to pursue. So if you reach this type of maturity no, of having this self-realization and self-development, no, this will help us to specify our ideal action or our ideal interest. So it will help us this kind of elements na ito talaga yung gusto natin. Ito yung path na para sa atin. Max Stirner, a German philosopher, proposes that the ultimate goal of one's action is self-governance, and to achieve it, one need not to take others' interest into consideration. According to him, class, I is absolute. For me, you are nothing but my food, even as I too am fed upon and turned to use by you. We have only one relation to each other, and that of usableness, of utility, of use. We owe each other nothing. For what I seem to owe you, I owe at most to myself. If you accept the psychological egoist view that one's ultimate goal is always one's own self-interest, for Stirner, any moral obligation to others is subject to one's own self-interest. As he puts it, class, that one must break faith, yes, even his oath, in order to determine himself instead of being determined by moral considerations. Therefore, acting for the sake of another person's interest is impossible, according to Max Stirner. However, class, there are some objections, of course. One of the objections in psychological egoism is that it is an example of a non-falsifiable theory. It is impossible, class, um, according from the views of other philosophers, it is impossible that one can know how much one's own motivation is of egoistic concern or it is altruistic concern. This kind of difficulty has to do with the fact that one can hardly know about one's own deep down motivation. On the other hand, it gives the psychological egoist an opportunity to argue that even a person who does charity for an altruistic reason might deep down deceiving herself. Since it is difficult plus to be certain about one's own deep down motivation, psychological egoist assumption that deep down we are all self-serving but not justified. Kasi hindi natin alam if we are doing this type of action ba because of altruistic reason, kasi hindi naman natin alam or hindi din alam ng ibang tao na you are doing that because of yourself or you're doing that because of for the welfare of other people. So, yun din yung isa sa mga mahirap i-justify yung psychological egoism. But of course, they have this assumption na lahat naman tayo, lahat ng ginagawa naman daw tayo is self-serving but not justified. Pero na lang siguro if you are really in a higher position of or higher position of being matured enough no na masasabi mo na you are in a self-actualized stage na talaga na you are able to identify decisions na mga wrong or right, or you have this kind of maturity na you are able to share no to share some lessons to other people, life lessons, or you are fully self-developed. No? So, paano kaya kung meron talagang ganun na mga, actually meron naman, those we consider mga people who shares, no, kung gusto ay kung ano lang kayo, kung mahilig kayo makinig sa mga life coaches, no? So, do we consider them as self-actualized person na kaya? So, it's for you to judge. A recent empirical study even challenges the dichotomy between egoism and altruism by showing that people who are capable of expressing extreme altruism or unselfish behaviors are labeled high in narcissism. In short, people daw class who has extreme expression in altruistic behavior are labeled with high narcissism. Narcissism means is an extreme self-involvement to the degree that it makes a person ignore the needs of those around them. So even these are unselfish acts, no? But if you are expressing it too much, so meron din siyang nagiging side effect. And then my tendency, you will have this kind of personality, narcissistic personality, na it makes you ignore the other needs of other people. Because maybe you are focusing on one lang. If sabi naman dito, expressing extreme altruism. There's nothing wrong doing altruistic behaviors class, but sometimes too much love will kill you. So 'di ba hindi rin joke lang yung class ha. Hindi rin good yung sobra-sobra din, no? So just like emotions, if we have this kind of expressing too much emotion, mapa-happy man yan or mapa-negative, meron talaga yung consequences after. Like, hindi naman consequences na pag happy ka ngayon and then later on you will have sadness no after. So what I'm trying to say is that kahit na happy ka, like for example, nanalo ka ng loto and then that time you reach that extreme happiness and then nasabi mo sa lahat na manglibre ka sa buong barangay and then suddenly na-realize mo ang dami mo palang bayaran na utang. 'di ba? So because of that emotion, nadala ka in that kind of decision. So napaano ka tuloy imbis na naging happy ka na, tuloy-tuloy na yung happiness mo. So because of that one click lang na decision kasi napaka-extreme ng emotion mo that time, no? Because of that decision. So napasama tuloy siya. Psychological egoists attempt to persuade us that we can never truly altruistic and hence a truly realistic account of human behavior would have no place for anything remotely resembling ethics. If ethics requires us, at least sometimes, not to pursue our own self-interest, but given that we hardly can know for sure our own deep down motivation, we might still be altruistic. Ethical egoism argues that even if we can, we should not be altruistic. Okay, let's proceed to the ethical egoism. While psychological egoism class claims that our ultimate goal of one's action is one's own self-interest, the ethical egoism naman claims that one should pursue one's own best interest. Now, let us explore more the ethical egoism. The basic idea of ethical egoism is this: promoting one's own best interest is in accord with morality. In its strongest form, ethical egoism claims that one acts morally if and only if one promotes one's own best interest. With this, we will understand the claims of Adam Smith and Ayn Rand of their ethical egoistic. So these are the two philosophers now who defined ethical egoism. We will end up with learning the biggest problem with ethical egoism, which serves as a transition to our next topic, the social contract theory. Okay, Adam Smith was a Scottish economist and philosopher who was a pioneer of political economy and key figure during the Scottish Enlightenment. Smith argues for egoism as a practical ideal in economics. He states that each business person promoting their best interest would most effectively promote the common good, given that the invisible hand, like the free market, would coordinate individual economic activities. In other words, if both buyers and the sellers pursue nothing but the best deal for themselves, there would be a win-win situation, for them both. So according to Smith, um, the successful function of the invisible hand depends on laissez-faire capitalism. Let's define laissez-faire capitalism. It is an economic philosophy of free market capitalism that opposes the government. This theory believes that economic success is more likely the less government are involved in business. So they don't involve in, they believe that in order na magkaroon ng economic success, no, the government should not involve. His form of ethical egoism is that every man is no doubt by nature first and principally recommended to his own care, and as he is fitter to take care of himself than of any other person, it is fit and right that it should be so. Although Smith believes that one should first pursue one's own best interest, Smith does not advocate being a selfish, cold, and a cold-blooded person. Instead, he argues that mutual kindness is necessary for happiness. Which is of course totoo naman. No? Mutual kindness is necessary for happiness. Starting from our natural drive of trying to share others' feelings as closely as possible, we adjust our feelings to the feelings of people we are concerned with, and in this process, we eventually develop virtue. So here naman, no, we consider people's other people's feeling. Like if we reach this mutuality na of the two person, like kanina yung example, the sellers and the buyers, no, if they are doing good, no, if they could have this win-win situation. So just like here, if we share or if we understand others feeling and then we reach that mutuality, then we can reach happiness. The two principal virtues, justice and beneficence, the exercise of beneficence deserves the highest reward. So here is the catch class. Given our natural drives and our social condition, we are on the path of developing virtues, the most important of which is beneficence or doing good. Yet, given that mutual kindness is necessary for happiness, we can say that practicing kindness is necessary for one's own best interest. In benefiting another person, one is still pursuing one's own self-interest. Just like from our previous lesson, that's not that if we practiced being a virtuous person, then all our actions are good. Just like here, kay Smith, we can say that practicing kindness is necessary for one's best interest. So if we practice our kindness, so there would be a tendency that we reach that happiness not just from ourselves, but we are pursuing also other person's interest. Let's proceed to Ayn Rand. Iba din yung perspective ni Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand was a Russian-born American writer and philosopher. She is known for her fiction and for developing a philosophical system. She named it Objectivism. She argues for ethical egoism and laissez-faire capitalism. However, she argues that selfishness is a virtue. And according to her, altruism, which demands self-sacrifice, is even immoral. And life is the ultimate value, and hence, no society can be of value to man's life if the price is the surrender of his right to his life. So for uh, for Rand, he states that altruism behaviors are immoral, and la and he believes also that the value of a man, no, or the life of a man could not be valued if he or she will surrender of his right to his life. She condemns that altruism is responsible for destroying the civilized world and added that altruism is also responsible for making totalitarian regimes such as the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Russia. Altruism holds death as its ultimate goal and standard of value, and it is logical that renunciation, resignation, self-denial, and every other form of suffering, including self-destruction, are the virtues it advocates. Ito daw yung ina-advocate ng altruistic behavior. Self-destruction, denial, resignation. Given that humans are rational beings and that life is the ultimate value, Rand states that rational selfishness is what one should pursue. To act rationally is to put one's own interest first. Kung kanina kay Smith, there are mutual decisions. So here naman kay Rand is for us to act rationally, we should put our own interest first before anything else. According to Rand, not only is promoting one's own best interest rational, it is also morally correct. No? So pursuing first our own best interest, according to Rand, it is morally correct. Based from the lectures given previously, ethical egoism is more appealing than the psychological egoism view. However, just like the psychological egoism na may biggest challenge siya or some problem, here naman sa ethical egoism, meron din siyang biggest challenge. Like, it lacks authoritative regulation of interpersonal conflicts of interest. So in short, the biggest problem here is that ethical egoism uh, gives or kung paano ba siya or the ethical egoism doesn't provide a rule on how to solve interpersonal conflicts, especially if they have this interest and then nagka-conflict but it benefits for their own interest. We have an example here. This is from the book. No, I assume that you read it in advance, so I will just read this. Suppose my grandfather indicated in his will that I am his sole heir, and suppose also that he is not bothered by any severe sickness. Suppose my cousin has been working her way to replace me as the sole heir, and suppose that I am in a bad situation which requires a lot of money that I don't have. Can it be morally wrong for me to kill my grandfather to ensure that I get the money now? Ethical egoism cannot answer this kind of question because it would not be morally wrong yung question na ito, but from my grandfather's perspective, it would be. And there's no way to adjudicate between this perspective. Someone might also argue that ethical egoism borders on being incoherent or being unclear. If what ethical egoism advocates is that everyone should do what is in their best interest, it seems confusing, if not outright inconsistent, that ethical egoism argues that doing so is how we promote the social good. In example, the good that goes beyond the scope of self-interest. So just like from the example kanina class, it could be the ethical egoism seems confusing and inconsistent because in the first place, the ethical egoism promotes social good. But what if, what if you really need that money to save or in order for you to survive, and that's the way na para ma-save ka from that difficulty, but the consequence is you will hurt the people or the person. So how would you say if that your best interest, no, na yun talaga yung pinaka best interest or that's your self interest is in a scope of doing social good. So yun yung naging mahirap. So nagiging unclear, no, yung perspective ng ethical egoism. So again class, hindi naman lahat ng theory is perfect. Hindi naman lahat ng perspective na sinishare ng mga philosophers were perfect, no? So meron talaga siyang mga shortcomings din, no? No, and debatable. Rand argues one should promote one's own good and altruism is immoral. Then it is confusing as to why she concerns himself with the issue of the survival of civilization, which presumably promotes the common good. The care, so as you can understand daw sa statement ni Rand, the care about promoting the social good while caring in promoting one's own best interest seems self-contradictory. Whether these statements are incompatible and damages the ethical egoism. Smith apparently thinks that they are not fundamentally incompatible because he finds a way to incorporate the virtue of benevolence into his ethical egoism. So meron siyang intervention doon, yung the virtue of benevolence. So for Smith, hindi siya problem na promoting social good while promoting one's own best interest is not a problem for Smith because he has this intervention of incorporating the virtue of benevolence into his ethical egoism. But the challenge, no, seems to apply to Rand na for her, no, na promoting one's own good and promoting social good while promoting one's own best interest is impossible or it's a conflict. Na for her, it is impossible, no? According to Randa, it is impossible daw na you are promoting your best interest while promoting the social good. Kasi nga, if you are promoting social good, yun yung altruistic behavior, di ba? You are doing unselfish behavior. So for her, it is impossible na masabay yung dalawang statement na yun or dalawang actions na yun, kumbaga, na you are promoting your one's own best interests and at the same time, you are also promoting the social good or yung welfare ng ibang tao. However, meron ding nagsasabi na it's a little bit confusing daw yung sinasabi ni Rand. It's because yung sa survival of civilization, no, it promotes common good. It's confusing class for other philosophers, no, or thinkers na Rand concerns herself with the issue of the survival of the civilization, which is this is an act of altruistic behavior that promotes, no, common good. But then for her, according sa kanya, is no, na impossible pagsamahin ang pag-identify or acting your own best interest while promoting common good or promoting good to other people. Pero concerned siya sa survival of civilization. So syempre ang nakakaalam lang niyan is si Rand, kung ano talaga ang kanyang motive, no, why she said this type of statement. The biggest problem for ethical egoism is that it fails to be a moral theory because it cannot deal with interpersonal conflicts of interest. Because asking people to pursue their individual interests is not enough. This shows that we can all benefit much more from cooperation. The issue of coordination is crucial given interpersonal conflicts of interest. Concern for coordination leads us to the last topic of this chapter, the social contract theory. So again, no, the biggest problem of the ethical egoism is that it cannot deal with interpersonal conflicts of interest in which people cannot pursue people or pursuing your own best interest is not enough. Rather, it is much better if we have a cooperation. Yan. And now, let us proceed to the last perspective in this topic, the social contract theory. The basic idea of this social contract theory in ethics is that ethical rules are sets of conventionally established limits we impose on ourselves in keeping with our own longer term interest. This answers the two fundamental questions about morality, namely what is required and why we should obey. What is morally required is what we as rational and self-interested agents tayo do or would agree upon. The reason why we should obey is that we have agreed or would do so if we were being fully rational. The social contract theory shares the core assumption of egoism that we are self-interested and rational agents. Rational agents means is a person or entity that always aims to perform the optimal actions based on the given premises and information. The social contract theory class, it provides a justification for why we should coordinate with others. So probably this would answer the lacking no dun sa ethical egoism na interpersonal conflict of interest. The social contract theory not only provides a way to handle conflicts of interest, but also provides a justification for it. Given extra assumptions about human nature, we might end up following Thomas Hobbes or John Rawls, but both agree that moral rules are essentially conventional and binding only to the degree that we see them as serving our own interests. If the moral and social rules are conventional or in standard, what would life be like without rules? And how would this establish a motivation for defining and then following such rules? And then we have this question also, why would we agree to obey a set of rules that sometimes limit our own self interest? According to Thomas Hobbes, the pre-political natural state of humanity, which he imagines as the state of nature, is a war of all against all in which people's lives are solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This miserable picture is derived no, from the following empirical and normative assumptions. His empirical assumptions are that people are sufficiently similar in their physical and mental faculties that no one is invulnerable and we all fear death. Hobbes' normative assumptions are that each person in the state of nature has the liberty to preserve their own lives and a right to do whatever in one's opinion is necessary for survival. Take note for that, for survival. He calls it the right of nature. There is no constraint on the right of nature. Every man has a right to do everything, even to one another's body. Given that resources are limited and we are all vulnerable in the process of exerting our rights of nature. Hobbes paints the state of nature as hell. Hobbes then envisions that we start to form social conventions based on mutual advantage. So what Thomas trying to imply that we as human we have the right to do everything that we want, no? In order for us to survive, tayong dalawa. Kasi nga, di ba, we emphasizes the cooperation here. And doon na nagsa-start or nabubuo yung social conventions or the standard na nabuo natin. If that standard is napag-usapan na or na-agree na natin, so that's the time we obey that, and that's the way or that's the rules na kailangan natin ma-survive. So both of us is may advantage, no? If you set this rule and you set this rule and then we have this mutual understanding, and then that would be our basis for survival. For example, although in the state of nature, there is nothing inherently wrong in harming you, I would be better off by refraining to do so if everyone else does the same. A social convention against injury is thus formed. Hobbes called such a convention a law of nature. The fundamental law of nature is to seek peace and follow it. Mhm. Whereas the upshot of the entire set of laws of nature is that law of gospel, whatsoever you require that others should do to you, that do ye to them. In short, Hobbes' social contact theory claims that moral requirements are nothing but social convention that we as rational and self-interested agents agreed upon for the sake of our survival. Given that everyone's life is vulnerable in the state of nature, it is mutually advantageous to obey the social convention na nabuo ng dalawang tao or for many people. A convention is a set of agreed or generally accepted standards, norms, social norms, or criteria, often taking the form of costume. So, in other term, it's a rule that is agreed, no, by many. So, yan yung nagiging norm ng isang society, the standard norm of the society. In social contexts, a convention may retain the character of unwritten law. For example, manner in which people greet each other, such as shaking each other's hand, is um, is an example of social convention. Yung napag-usapan nyo lang na rule, no? So hindi talaga siya unwritten law. However, there are certain types of rules or costume na magiging law siya, or that rule is magiging formal na siya, magiging formal na and enforce, no? Enforce to do in a society. But yun nga, sabi dito nga sa social contract theory, it doesn't mean naman na it's a formal in a society na gagawin mo. Just like for example, if sa pamilya ninyo, you have to create a social convention, no? Hindi naman siya na kung ano yung rule ninyo sa family ninyo is law na rin ng maraming tao. So hindi. Kung ano yung napag-usapan ninyo, ano yung naging mutual decision ninyo for you to survive, no? You have to follow or you have to obey that social convention na nabuo ninyo. Social conventions, another definition is rules and norms governing the countless behaviors all of us engage in every day without necessarily thinking about them. So actually, we can use this in our everyday life. No, if we have a person na conflict natin, no, is if we if both of us will hear each other's sides and exchange opinions and suggestions, then peace will be achieved. David Gauthier is a contemporary Habitian. He argues that social conventions agreed upon as moral requirements are derived from a bargaining process over mutually advantageous conventions. People with the upper hand have little incentive to produce a fair convention for the weak. Then, according to David naman, is these social conventions na nabuo, they are more on bargaining process, no? Rather than na naging mutual decisions siya because he assumes that there is a little to gain from cooperating with the weak and little to fear of their revenge. Even if a fair convention that takes care of the interest of the weak is agreed upon, it does not guarantee that the strong will obey. After all, whether it is advantageous to follow a particular convention, it also depends on one's bargaining power. So there is a tendency, class, no, na that social convention between the weak and the strong doesn't guarantee na yung social convention na yan is a way for them to survive kasi hindi mo naman malalaman if that is a convention between the weak and the strong. Kasi what if the strong will take advantage of it and then the weak will just approve, no, so may tendency na magkakaroon talaga ng inequality, no, between the two. In Gauthier's theory, defenseless or people with disabilities fall beyond the pale of morality of this kind of social convention. So if the moral constraints will only arise if people are roughly equal in power. If moral requirements are all about the strong exploiting the weak, we don't even need to call them requirements because humans easily, if not naturally, act that way. Another contemporary social contract theory is the Kantian contractarianism. Kantian contractarianism bases the social contract on a natural equality of moral status, which makes each person's interest a matter of impartial concern or neutral concern, which takes each person as an end in itself, an intrinsically valuable moral status, and demands each person act in accord with universalizable personal policies, which Kant calls maxims, as a member of the community. Okay, to understand it further, following Kant's idea that our equal status as an end in itself demands us to act in a neutral way in a community. John Rawls develops a social contract theory that answers the question, what terms of cooperation would free and equal citizens agree to under fair conditions? So for John Rawls, in order for the citizens or in order for us to have fair conditions, we should, since we have this free and equal being positions, so we should collectively figure out the social contract that we agreed upon so that we will avoid the strong having dominant bargaining power over the weak, no, in the process na tinatawag ni Gauthier kanina na bargaining power between the strong and the weak. So for John Rose naman, in order for us to cooperate and to have a fair condition, so we should collectively figure out the social contract that we agreed. So it's not about the power, it's not about bargaining power. But then, if Rawls stipulates that people in the original position make the bargain under a veil of ignorance. That is, people have no idea of their natural talents and their social position. Rowe's idea of the original position does not refer to any actual historical event. Rather, it is a device that helps us vividly imagine a fair and impartial point of view when we reason about fundamental principles of justice. He believes also that people will come up with and endorse a fair contract in an impartial way. So then, if inequality is unavoidable, it must be justified to those made worse off. So here, we are considered under the veil of ignorance in which we have no idea kung ano yung talent natin and we don't have idea na kung ano yung social position natin or our position in a society. But rather, in Rowe's idea, um, we should we should imagine, no, a fair a fair a fair and impartial or neutral point of view without thinking of your position. It's either you are in a or without thinking your power, either you're strong or you are weak, when we will when in terms of justice. So if we are in a veil of ignorance at the term, no, by Rawls, people will come up with and endorse a fair condition or a fair contract in a neutral way. He assumes that people will act benevolently if they are rational, self-interested, and behind the veil of ignorance. Thus, the original position represents equality between human beings as moral persons. Okay, that's the end of our topic class for the lecture 4, and we'll proceed to the some conclusions. First, it is probably true that we have the tendency to act for the sake of promoting our own best interest. The starting point of both egoism and social contract theory is that we are self-interested and we are rational beings. However, basing morality on self-interest alone does not get us far and even defeats the idea of morality. Social contract theory for Hobbes, Gauthier, and Rawls' work can still suffer from the prisoner's dilemma, where everyone rationally acts in a self-interested way, even when doing so is detrimental for the good of all involved. Moral requirements based on agreement thus still lack sufficient force to ensure that everyone in fact does comply. That's yung sa weak and the strong. The Rawls-Kantian idea is a move toward objective and impartial ethics principles. And the rest of the topics explores the other philosophers who based such principles upon reason. Alright, that's it class for our lecture 4 hoping that you learned something new for this session or for this lecture, and you made some reflections, especially on defining your own action or motivation of doing moral acts, of course, or obligation. Either your motive is doing that for your own self or for the good of other people, or both. So this is our references. So if you want to research more, you can use these references. And I will remind you also na ang lesson na ito is nasa nasa PDF book natin entitled The Introduction to Philosophy Ethics. Okay, thank you, class. Stay connected and stay safe. If you have questions regarding the lessons and the answer sheets, please feel free to message me. Thank you. God bless.